Perfect. Good evening, everybody. I'm Annie Regan. I am the campaigns director at Penn Future. Penn Future is an environmental nonprofit in Pennsylvania working to shape environmental policy at all government levels. Our goal is to ensure everyone has a stable climate, clean air, pure water, and a responsive democracy. Before we start, I want to thank our co-sponsor of our event tonight, the Ohio River Valley Institute, known as ORVI. ORVI is a think tank focused on lasting job growth, clean energy, and more inclusive civic structures for Northern Appalachia. Thank you, ORVI, and we'll learn more about them shortly. Next slide, please. All right, we are going to quickly go over some Zoom logistics for our webinar tonight. If you would like to enable closed captioning, please look to the bottom of your screen. You will see the word captions. You can click that and then click the option to enable closed captioning. After the event, we'll send an email to everyone with a recording of the presentation, as well as links and resources shared in the chat. So feel free to just fully listen and don't have to take as many notes as you might have thought. So coming into the meeting. We will also hold questions until the end of the webinar. Please feel free to add questions in the Q&A section as we go along. You'll see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. The chat is also available if a speaker mentions a term or a concept that needs extra clarification. Our goal for this webinar is for folks to have a better understanding of this issue, so please chime in if something does not make sense, and we can make sure that we address those questions. I also want to ask folks to please be respectful to each other in the chat. We know energy issues in Pennsylvania can be complicated, and some communities face more harm from industry than others. Please assume that we are all here under the best intentions tonight. The purpose of this webinar is to showcase our research and findings, and that we hope should inspire more much-needed advocacy on this issue. We do not have all the answers on how best to navigate forward, but we hope that this serves as a space to network and connect with others across the state who share similar concerns on our energy future. We also hope to do more webinars and call to actions on this topic, so we hope you'll work together with us and other partners going forward who are doing great work on this issue. As we are getting started, and I see folks already doing this, which is great, please take a moment to introduce yourselves in the chat. Please let us know your name, where you're joining us from, the name of your organization, if that applies to you. And so now that we have the Zoom nuts and bolts kind of covered, I want to also quickly go over our panel tonight, as you might have seen from our promo for this webinar. This includes Patrick McDonnell, CEO and President at Penn Future, Donna Kohurt, Policy Manager for Sustainable Economics at Penn Future, and Sean O'Leary, Senior Researcher at the Ohio River Valley Institute. Penn Future Clean Water Campaign Manager Ollie is also leading technical support tonight, so please feel free to send them a note if you have issues in the chat or Q&A section, and Ollie will provide Zoom assistance. Now, to kick us off, we'll be hearing from Penn Future CEO and President Patrick McDonnell.
Hi, everybody, and thank you so much, Annie. Pat McDonnell, as was said, President and CEO of Penn Future. Just want to thank everybody for taking some time to be here tonight. I was very excited to kick off this conversation, and I'm sure you all have heard the hype, the buzz around data centers from social media and news, local community meetings, and just talking to your friends and neighbors. For those who are new to this topic, data centers are essentially buildings that house IT equipment, servers, data storage drives, network equipment that store and process digital data for companies and individuals. They come in all sizes, from shipping container sized micro data centers to multi-building hyperscale facilities that may cover hundreds or even thousands of acres. Data centers have existed for many years, but increased demand, primarily due to development of artificial intelligence, has caused a dramatic uptick in development. Now we're hearing a lot of big promises of economic rewards from big tech through AI and data center development. And here in Pennsylvania, the frack gas industry is trying to position itself to be the sole energy provider. Meanwhile, many Pennsylvanians, I'm sure including many on this webinar, are skeptical and asking, I think, good and important questions, such as why are we leaving out cheap, clean, fast to deploy renewables from this conversation? Where is the opportunity for community input into where and how these facilities are being built? How will we ensure that these data centers do not raise our already skyrocketing high electricity bills? How will this affect land and water in my community? And will these billion-dollar tech companies pay for their fair share of the impacts? As we see a proliferation of data center proposals coming to Pennsylvania, our staff here at Penn Future and our partner organizations continue to ask these questions, as well as another critical one, and that is, who's actually driving this call for data centers? Well, one of the reasons we're here tonight is one of those prominent voices behind this is Team PA. The Team Pennsylvania Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that works closely with state decision makers to execute their mission of growing the state's economy. And since their inception in 1997, Team PA has championed fossil fuels as the key and primary means of economic development and prosperity for the Commonwealth. Tonight, we'll learn more from our expert panel about how this group of unelected economic development professionals are currently making decisions about our economic future and what their current plan is to attract AI and data centers with the promise of fracked gas. Now we'll be hearing from my colleague, Donna Kohurt, Policy Manager for Sustainable Economics at Penn Future, who will give an overview of who Team PA is and their latest energy scenarios report entitled Highways, Homesteads, and Field. Donna, take it away.
Thank you, Pat. Appreciate the introduction, and thank you for doing a quick intro of Team PA as well. Next slide. All right. So yes, my name is Donna Kohurt. I'm the Policy Manager for Sustainable Economic Development here at Penn Future. I'm going to talk a little bit more about who Team PA is. I'm going to be as quick as I can, though, because I know time is limited. And then we'll talk about how they're trying to shape our energy future here in Pennsylvania and our economy. Next slide. All right, so real quick, this is what we're looking at. I'll add a little bit more information about who Team PA is. As Pat said, I'm going to talk about their 2024 project, Highways, Homesteads, and Fields, and how that leads us to today, their latest project, their Energy and Artificial Intelligence Roadmap. So here we go. Next slide. As Pat said, Team PA is a 501c3. They were created back in 1997 by executive order, and since then, every governor has basically kind of re-upped that executive order, if you will. And the governor is always a co-chair on this as well. So there is a very direct tie to our government. But that being said, they are not elected officials, the Team PA staff. But they do have several boards of directors, including a private sector board, which includes a very, very long list of various companies and entities. And several of those are energy companies like Constellation or Core Natural Resources. And then finally, an important bit of context to understand why we are bringing them up now in this conversation is they do have a proven history of supporting the fossil fuel industry. For folks who are on this call who may have been fighting frack gas from the beginning, including pipelines here in eastern Pennsylvania, they're probably very familiar with this organization, and other folks may have never heard of them. But they did support a lot of that infrastructure when things were just getting started. And most recently, they did support the Shell cracker plant out in western Pennsylvania in Beaver County, excuse me. And the cracker plant is essentially a plastics manufacturing facility. And it is a facility that was meant to kind of anchor an entire series of petrochemical facilities in that general region. It was a flop. The cracker plant just opened a few years ago, and it's proven to be an economic disappointment and an environmental nightmare for the people who live in its shadow, essentially. And the people of Pennsylvania basically paid $6 billion for this. So this is just a touch of the history of who Team PA is and why they're important for this conversation. Next slide. So in 2024, they came out with a project that they called Highways, Homesteads, and Fields. And essentially what this was kind of a visioning exercise, if you will. And Team PA got a bunch of their partners together to kind of go through this exercise and envision 3 different futures for Pennsylvania between the year 2025 and 2050. Now, after I went through this report several times, I was on one of the webinars with Team PA and actually asked the question, in each of these scenarios, when you're imagining what Pennsylvania's energy future and economy could be, why didn't any of these scenarios start with a massive investment in clean energy? And what I was told is that the purpose of the project was to imagine what likely could happen, not what we think should happen. So if that tells you anything about the lack of vision for this organization and kind of what they think we are capable of here in Pennsylvania, kind of sets the stage. And ultimately, these 3 scenarios, in each of them, right out the gate, we double down on fracked gas, on its development, on burning of it. And a lot of that is in the service of data centers within this report they came out with in 2024. And within these scenarios, between 2025 and 2050, we continue to do that. We continue to focus on burning gas until something changes. And that big change is population loss, it's job loss, and it's an affordability crisis. For those of you at home, you're probably yelling at your screen right now, like, Donna, we've got that. We've got that trifecta, especially the affordability crisis. And you're absolutely right. But in these scenarios that Team PA is imagining, we don't shift gears until about 2045. And it's happening now in 2025. Next slide. And so these are some of the participants. Again, there's a longer list of organizations and companies that do engage with this project. Some of them, we don't really know who engages in what capacity. We don't know that much, but these are some of the companies that do. And these are energy companies, if you're not familiar. Next slide. Great. So the majority of this project that they release is narrative. It's storytelling. But then at the end of it, they do provide some really helpful charts and graphs to kind of play out various numbers and provide some data as to what kind of the consequences are for various decisions that are made throughout them. And so I'm just using this particular one as an example because I feel like it's a pretty good source and it's pretty accessible. So we've got 3 pie charts. Each of them represents one of these scenarios. And as you can see, this represents the kind of power generation, the fuel source for power generation by 2050. So this is 2050. We've got nuclear, coal, gas, solar, and wind on the board. When you look at homesteads and fields, I want you to note, first of all, we're still burning coal. It's 10%, but we are still burning coal. It's not great. And then when you look at highways and homesteads, credit where credit is due, you can see that the pieces of the pie for solar and wind are getting bigger. Right now, I think we have about 4% of our energy in Pennsylvania is generated by renewables. And those two kick it up to about 25 to 26%. That's an improvement. But that improvement is 2050. And that's too slow and that's too little for the change that we need. And you also may be saying, well, look at those two again, and you see gas is down to 30% and 26%, which is much lower than what we're doing today. But again, when you dig into it and you read the scenarios, you'll see that we don't get there again until 2050. And at the beginning of these scenarios, we truly double down and go hard on burning fracked gas. So the emissions skyrocket, especially I believe it's for highways at the very beginning. And it takes a lot to come back down and it's very drastic at the end. Next slide. All right. So in summary, before I move on to their current roadmap, highways, homesteads, and fields, at the end of this, essentially what they predicted or envisioned is three futures in which we're just going to continue to rely on frack gas and we're going to increase that reliance. And a lot of that is due to data centers coming in and the goal to attract them. That means 25 more years of increases in burning fracked gas and building out frack gas development and infrastructure. It also means that there's really not an attempt to meaningfully transition to cleaner technology until around 2045 in these scenarios, which again is kind of too late. And also, finally, none of this really shifts until we fall behind neighboring states, we lose job and we lose population. And we've already seen some of that happening through the frack gas boom. Next slide. All right, so we're going to now talk about their current project, which they call their Energy and Artificial Intelligence Roadmap. Next slide. All right, let's set the stage. This probably won't surprise many people in the room. Here's a map of the US. I gladly circled Pennsylvania, and we also have Virginia in there. What we're looking at, those blue circles represent planned data center development by 2030. Full disclosure, this looks like it's probably not comprehensive, but work with me here. But what you can see is if you look below Pennsylvania, you've got a bunch of blue dots layered on top of one another, very concentrated but relatively small. That's Virginia, and they are currently being overwhelmed by data centers. And just up above that in Pennsylvania, we don't have as many circles right now, but they are huge. If you look at the rest of the US, the ones that we have by and large are larger than most on that map. So what those circles represent is the amount of power that the planned data center projects will require. And so just for scale, they're going to require a lot. Next slide. So what is this roadmap I'm talking about? If you go to the website, it's a lot to dig through. It's not kind of a linear document you flip through. There's a lot of pieces. The main points is that they have 6 strategic goals that they lay out very clearly. They provide timelines and they provide essentially benchmarks to how they get to those goals. And then finally, they also share ideas for policy of how to do this, how to get there. So we know what they're thinking. And ultimately, this demonstrates to us that they have a plan to transform our economy and our entire energy sector through both the adoption and use of artificial intelligence, as well as fueling data centers with fracked gas. Next slide. Great. So I will kind of go quickly through the 6 strategic goals, but there's going to be a couple that I'm going to stay on, and many of them I'm just going to kind of flip through for in respect for time. So the first one, just to give you a sense of what they're thinking and they're doing, leveraging AI. Essentially, what Team PA wants to do is to increase the adoption of artificial intelligence, specifically in this one, to work with our grid, to make our grid more efficient, to facilitate demand response, to figure out where to site large projects. Next slide. They also want to, in step 2, or excuse me, goal 2, commercialize artificial intelligence innovation. The long and short of this is we have a lot of smart folks doing a lot of scientific work here in the state of Pennsylvania. We've got a lot of research and development happening, especially in artificial intelligence. Team PA, in service of growing the state's economy, would like to see that research go from research to commercialization. They want businesses to be created. They want to see startups spin off, and they want to get that technology to market. Next slide. Strategic goal number 3. This is where we're going to pause. This is where Penn Future is very concerned. So Team PA, they want to build a huge amount of energy generation. They want to build what they are saying is by 2030, so this is, or 2035, so this is a 10-year plan. By 2035, they want to build 10 to 12 gigawatts of generation. And I'll get to what that means in a minute. But they're doing this in service of artificial intelligence and data centers. Now, when they say they want the energy generation, this is where why are we not doing renewables comes into play. It's because they want what they are calling, quotations, firm power. For them, that means gas. Going through the roadmap, they're now saying that, well, nuclear would best serve this sector, essentially, but takes a long time to build a traditional nuclear power plant, at least a decade, likely more. So let's go to gas. On top of that, they know that it's hard to get these power plants online. It doesn't go quickly. It takes a long time. There's a bottleneck to get on the grid. So they want to build the power plant and have the data center come in afterwards. We call that behind the meter generation. You build the power plant creates energy for the data center. If there's extra, maybe it goes on the grid, but power plant goes to data center, not to us. So that's their plan. Now, the size of this, so they want 10 to 12 gigawatts by 2035. Their kind of like short-term goal is 5 to 7 by 2030. Now, what does that mean? Let's look at one particular project that we're keeping our eye on in Western Pennsylvania, in Homer City. There are plans to build the nation's largest gas-fired power plant, 4.5 gigawatts. That is ginormous. That is a huge gas plant. And so if they do that, if they get this one set up, they've just about reached that 2030 goal. Check the box. So if you're wondering, why is there such a big push here in Homer City? Why is this such a focus? Maybe this is part of the reason. There is a plan here. Next slide. This is just a visual to help out with the Homer City piece. Again, we've got some circles on the board. If you look at the giant blue one in Western Pennsylvania with the big red circle around it, that's Homer City. And fun fact, we know, or we've seen some permits start to move forward for the gas plant, but nobody is stepping up to claim the data center yet. There is no data center yet. And we don't know of any companies that are thinking of building one there yet. Next slide. So we've got a few more of these strategic goals. I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. The next one is innovation corridors. I'm sharing this because they've got a plan to transform our economy, which will transform our communities. These corridors, the idea behind them is to take the tech industry, which right now is really kind of concentrated in places like Pittsburgh and Philly and a bit here in the Lehigh Valley where I live. And they want to expand that. They want to provide opportunities to get into this industry across the state and other regions. Not the worst idea in the world to try to provide some higher paying, higher skilled jobs in places that are outside of our largest metropolitan areas. Maybe. The problem is they want to anchor those with data centers. And what we now know is the data centers are anchored by gas plants, to be very simplistic about it. This is a concern. Next slide. Permitting. They would like to see all of this done very, very quickly, which means they want permitting to go faster. And we know the governor has already tried to make it go faster, but they want more. So their idea is to create different ways, different policies to speed this up. There's also land use issues. So I want to note that for folks who are interested in land use and municipal ordinances, that there is part of this roadmap that says that they would like to see the state of Pennsylvania to create model zoning ordinances that they can hand to municipalities. And municipalities who may not already have a proper ordinance on their book or may not have the general capacity, because municipal officials generally don't have a ton of capacity, may find this much easier to do, and with resources limited, may not think twice. They also want to create things called opportunity zones, which are basically kind of like tax relief zones for certain industries, and they're looking at that for this industry as well. Next slide. This is the last strategic goal. This one is a bit interesting where they talk about PA-based sourcing. Essentially, what they would like to see is Pennsylvania manufacturers turn into suppliers for both data centers themselves as well as energy development. So this is making various kinds of components and that sort of thing, so that once these get into place, or as they're coming into place, we have manufacturers coming into and creating a supply chain. So this would theoretically be an attempt to expand the economic impact of this industry. Next slide. Great. So this is a summary. It's my second to last slide, I think. So ultimately, just to kind of round it out, what is Team PA trying to do with their roadmap? One, in terms of energy, they want that behind the meter generation. They find that as a priority because then they can avoid this whole PJM mess, which has a bottleneck and waiting in line. And instead, you create the power plant and you plug the data center into it instead of the grid. They also would like to see frack gas be that bridge to nuclear. We used to hear that frack gas was the bridge to renewables. Apparently, that is out of style. It's now the bridge to nuclear. Take that for whatever you will. And finally, they don't think that renewables provide firm power. Now, again, transparency, they do mention renewables. They do mention virtual power plants, but it's in terms of renewables and battery storage being a key component, that's not the case. It's really focused on gas development. Land use, just talked about that. They're talking about state developed model ordinances. They're talking about fast tracking the permitting. And in terms of the economics, things to be aware of is that they want to establish the in-state data center supply chain. They would like data centers to be these economic anchors in various regions across the state. And again, when you've got the data center, it looks like it's going to be fueled by a gas plant at times. That's not going to be great for the health and well-being of those communities. And then finally, they're looking at various tax and financial incentives. Next slide. So ultimately, the good, the bad, and the ugly of this. To start with, the good. And first, before the chat blows up, I want to be very clear. I don't like this plan. I am not saying the plan is good. What I will say, though, is that for years, some of us have been saying that Team PA needs to be more transparent. They've literally handed us a roadmap. They've literally given us their timelines, and they've literally shown us what policies they want to use to get there, to create this future for Pennsylvania. And again, these are not elected officials. And since they're showing us this, I think we have the responsibility to use it and to learn about it and to figure out how we want to see it changed and figure out what future we want for Pennsylvania that would be different than this. The bad, data centers aren't job creators. I'm going to leave the rest of that to Sean. He'll tell you more. And also, communities don't want data centers. Bet you if we took a poll right now, probably 100% of us would be like, don't want that in my backyard. And then finally, the really ugly is it means more gas development. It means burning more gas. And also, this one's more of a question. Is AI a bubble? We're not really sure. People have very strong opinions about it. There's a lot of talk on the internet. I'm sure folks in this room have their own opinion. But my question is, if AI is a bubble, but we're building the gas plants first, what happens if the data center never shows, or if the data center shows and falls through? And these are questions we should be asking ourselves as we look at this plan that Team PA has for our future. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our friend Sean to get into more of the details about the economic impacts of data centers themselves. Take it away, Sean.
Well, Donna, thank you very much. And thank you also, Annie and Pat. I'm grateful to be here and to have Worthy represented in the conversation. If we could go to the next slide. And, well, the one beyond that, too. I think many of us recall from a few months ago now an energy summit, as it was termed at the time, that was held at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, at which there were some remarkable announcements made about investments in Pennsylvania. Most of those investments having to do with data centers, either data centers themselves being constructed or the energy infrastructure that they require being constructed. And it was striking because virtually every headline that came out of that event focused on the amount of money that would be invested in Pennsylvania, which came by the time the smoke cleared to about $110 billion. And that sounds like a very, very impressive amount of money, and in some ways it is. But it's also one of the most misleading numbers that anybody can look at if what they really care about is economic development and prosperity. The other number that's spectacularly misleading, but which is for many people their sort of go-to statistic for assessing economic impact, is the effect on gross domestic product, GDP. And if we could go to the next slide. Whoops. The reason that these two numbers are so misleading is that we know that they don't actually relate very much to the measures of economic prosperity that are felt by human beings, that people actually care about, things like jobs and income. And we know this because we've seen this happen before. A few minutes ago, Donna referred to the Shell petrochemical complex in Beaver County, which was noteworthy because it involved $14 billion of investment by Shell. It's $14 billion of investment that actually produced no measurable growth in jobs or economic activity in Beaver County, apart from a very temporary spike that occurred during the construction phase. We know it also because when you look back to the natural gas boom in which Pennsylvania has been the leader, but which also involved Ohio and West Virginia, that particular initiative actually did involve, there's that number again, $110 billion of investment. And that was $110 billion of investment concentrated in just 30 counties between Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. And in those 30 counties, not only have we not seen job growth or population growth or significant income growth, we've actually seen significant declines. And if you could go to the next slide. We, the reason for that is that very little of the money that's actually invested or the revenue that's generated by these industries finds its way into local economies. And so the effect that you see is this bizarre situation in which we see that counties that participated heavily, for instance, in the natural gas boom, were absolute stars in the US economy with respect to GDP growth. If you look at the chart in the lower left-hand corner, you can see measurements of GDP performance and of Pennsylvania's rural counties, those that are not part of metropolitan areas. The 10 counties that were very heavily immersed in the natural gas boom saw immense economic growth as measured by GDP, especially compared to the counties that were not. But then when you go to the chart in the lower right, you see that even though one set of counties saw immense growth in GDP and another set saw almost no growth in GDP, when it comes to jobs and incomes, they're pretty much the same. If you could go to the next slide. And so, the question is, why does this happen? Because, kind of common sense tells you, right, that if you get a ton of investment, billions, tens, or in this case, hundreds of billions of dollars of investment, common sense tells you something good should come of that. How can you put $110 billion into 30 counties in Appalachia and have almost nothing to show for it? Well, the answer is that the industries that we're talking about that participated in the shell cracker, in the natural gas boom, and as we'll see in a second, in the development of data centers are highly, highly capital intensive, meaning a lot of money has to be invested in order to build them out, but they're not very labor intensive. meaning that they don't provide many jobs in the communities where they arise. And that's important because economic development depends on money being injected into local economies and then circulating within those economies. But if the industries that are growing are not injecting very much money, then there's not much effect. And the primary means through which most industries do inject money into economies are jobs. And if there aren't very many jobs, then there's not much money. If you could go to the next slide. We know this because when you look at data centers, there are no firm measurements of jobs associated with data centers, but we've got a lot of indicators out there that give us a pretty good idea of what's going on. The first one is that we've gone out and looked around at the major data center companies, developers worldwide, and we took the top seven who, in between them, have developed 811 data centers globally. And I should emphasize that they operate these data centers also. And we found that they employ an average of just 27 people per data center. And if you go to the next slide, and so when we talk about a data center, you know, being built, if it only employs 27 people or maybe even as many as 50 people, the economic impact from that level of employment is negligible to non-existent. In a couple of presentations and in a couple of stories I've written, I've likened it to having the economic impact of an olive garden. And, olive gardens are nice. I like them. But they're not economic game changers, which is exactly what data centers are being sold as. Now, there is another component to this, which is that, of course, when you talk to proponents of data centers, they say, well, looky, it's not just about how many jobs there will be long term. There are other things going on here. For instance, think of all the construction jobs that are going into data centers. And indeed, it's true. There is a period of usually about 12 to 18 months where you do see significant job growth around data centers. But what's interesting is that even then, it's a relatively small spur to local economies. In fact, when you look at the cost of building a data center, only about 2.5% of the dollars that are being invested actually goes to construction for that might employ local workers. The rest of it is going to hardware and software that is primarily being imported from elsewhere and has little economic impact in the communities. Next slide, please. And so proponents of data centers will then say, well, yeah. But, okay, so data centers themselves may not provide all that many jobs, but look at everything that's part of their value chain and all the jobs that those applications are creating. And of course, so, let's do it. Let's take a look at data centers' value chain. Data centers, as was pointed out a minute ago by Donna, are primarily expected to be powered in our region by natural gas. Well, the funny thing is that natural gas as an industry, especially power plants in particular, share that same deadly characteristic of being very highly capital intensive and not very labor intensive. And we're going to return to the Olive Garden analogy for a moment because when you look at 1,000 megawatt power plant, which is the size of many gas-fired power plants in our region, if you're in Western Pennsylvania, you're probably familiar with the Tenaska plant in Westmoreland County or the Hickory plant up in Lawrence County. And all of the plants, except for the one that Donna alluded to that's associated with the development in Indiana County, fall in that 1,000 to 2,000 megawatt range. The average employment in facilities of that size for power plants is 25 to 30. Again, we're in another Olive Garden scenario. And then people say, well, yeah. But what about jobs that are even further upstream of that, meaning natural gas and fracking? Um, to the degree that any of you are familiar with the Ohio River Valley Institute in Norvey, it may be because you know that for the last 5 years, we've been following, tracking, and documenting the jobs performance of the natural gas industry, and you saw it alluded to before. And of course, what we find is that I just described data centers as being capital intensive and non-labor intensive, and power plants as being the same. Well, guess what? The most capital intensive and least labor intensive category in the entire American economy is fracking. So, what we're talking about when we talk about the data center value chain and the jobs that are created, as you go up and down the ladder, you find that they all share that same characteristic and consequently are likely to produce the same results that we've seen from the natural gas boom in the region. If you could go to the next slide. And so that brings us to, okay, so where do we actually stand as a result of data centers? Because up until now, I've specifically avoided the last major point, and probably the point that is seized upon most enthusiastically by local policymakers, county commissioners, mayors, state legislators, and that has to do with the tax revenue from data centers. Because we know that data centers come in, they're very large, they're very expensive, and potentially they can generate a great deal of tax money. And they do. In Pennsylvania, we know from an economic analysis that was paid for by the Data Center Coalition that in 2023, data centers provided about $1.36 billion in state and local taxes in Pennsylvania. And that's actually a really interesting number because Pennsylvania as a state has waived its sales and use taxes altogether for data centers. And many communities are also abating or otherwise reducing property taxes by up to 75%, which leaves only the net income tax to really provide much in the way of revenue, although that's a fairly small tax and doesn't do much to get us very much money. Still, $1.36 billion is a lot. But what is not talked about by much of anybody is how data centers are taking disposable income away from Pennsylvanians. We know from recent analyses by the monitor of PJM, the organization that operates the grid in Pennsylvania and 13 other states, that in Pennsylvania, data centers have already cost ratepayers in the state $2.2 billion in higher electric bills. In other words, data centers are actually removing more disposable income from Pennsylvania's economy than they're injecting into the economy. And if you use the same economic modeling software that was used for the Data Center Coalition study that I referred to a minute ago, what you find out is that if you suck $2.2 billion out of Pennsylvania's economy, it results in the loss of, the slide says 13,000 jobs. It actually should say 17,000 jobs statewide, which not coincidentally is about the number of people who work in data centers in the entire state of Pennsylvania. In other words, any economic development benefit that data centers are presumed to provide is basically canceled out by the costs that they impose. And that returns us finally to another point that Donna made a moment ago, which is much state policy in Pennsylvania on data centers as well as other areas is premised on the notion that anything that you can do to increase, to expand markets for fracked gas from Pennsylvania is ipso facto an economic benefit to the state. If there's nothing else that Orvy's research has demonstrated over the past 5 years, it's that that is an utter and a complete myth. And so I can go deeper on any of these issues if you like. I just want to close by making one final point, and that is that data centers are, in all likelihood, not going to be as widely prevalent as are being forecast. Recently, as in a week ago, an analytics company called Enverus, which works primarily for the fossil fuel industry. We're subscribers, but their primary stock and trade is data for fossil fuel companies, determined that basically the forecasts for load growth associated with data centers in PJM, the region that includes Pennsylvania, is probably exaggerated by about two-thirds. And so while it is very likely that there will be some load growth associated with data centers, it's also very possible and perhaps likely that the load growth will be considerably less than is anticipated, which raises the specter of another threat coming from data centers, which Donna also alluded to, and that is a threat of stranded assets. The good news, however, is that as we see data centers being proposed seemingly on every piece of land that's greater than about 100 acres in size, it means that as advocates, we actually have a pretty strong likelihood of being able to defeat many of them because the underlying economics are working against them, a fact that will become more and more obvious to prospective funders, to the investors who they have to turn to, who developers have to turn to raise capital. And so I hope folks will come away from this conversation feeling pretty optimistic because on many occasions, and perhaps if we're to believe the numbers from Enverus, most occasions, these proposed data centers can be stopped and defeated. Thanks very much, and I'll be happy to throw it back to you, Annie, and any questions.
Thanks so much, Sean. And yes, we will share the slides, the wonderful slideshows that you just saw, later in the post webinar email. If we could go to the next slide. Great. And before we get into the Q&A section, which I see there's a lot of questions already in the Q&A box, so thank you so much for that. I want to call attention to a very important call to action. Tonight, we went over in detail who Team PA is and how they are making short-sighted economic decisions for us that puts our health, jobs, and energy bills at risk. However, because they are an unelected group of economic professionals, unfortunately, there are a few ways that we can hold them personally accountable. So therefore, Penn Future is encouraging folks to reach out to Majority Chair of the Pennsylvania House Energy Committee, Liz Fiedler. State Rep Liz Fiedler is one of our few environmental champions that we have in our state legislature, serving also as the chair of the House Blue-Green Caucus. She has led many clean energy initiatives in Pennsylvania, such as the very successful Solar for Schools program. We've made it easy for you to reach out to her to voice your concerns about data centers powered by fracked gas. We believe this is a great first step of many to get our legislators to start hearing our concerns and our energy priorities. Team PA has their vision. Pennsylvanians have ours. We need to make sure that they hear our vision. You can scan the QR code on the screen to get the action alert. You can type in the link also shared on the screen. I believe Natalie is also going to be dropping the link. And there you can see a pre-written letter that you can also add and edit to have your voice shaped into it. But within that action alert, we propose increasing renewable energy generation, fair fees and payments, consumer protection from costs from data centers, and more community input because, frankly, there is not enough. And I see that there are a lot of questions that even we don't have the answers to, that are good questions to ask our elected officials, because frankly, we are not seeing a lot of communication about it, and there are a lot of unknowns. So we'll take another minute or two for folks to kind of look at that action alert, send it to the House Energy Committee. It's not the be-all action alert to address this issue. It's one of many. We need to continually talk to our legislators about this issue. And Penn Future, and I'm sure a lot of other groups on this call, are finding different avenues to do that. So feel free to share that link, and we'll also have it in the follow-up email. All right. So we can go into the Q&A because I want to be mindful of our time, and we have about 10 minutes or so. But I think maybe our panel can stay for a few minutes, but after 7, if that's okay. But if not, we can kind of get into it. And if we don't answer your question, Donna, myself, and the Penn Future team can kind of work on the back end and try to get the answers. There, again, are a lot of unknowns that we're not even sure. We're trying to do this research in real time because this is such a newer industry. So we want to make sure we're providing the right answers with thorough research. So thank you for everyone's patience and really great questions. So let me look into here. So I guess we can get started. This is a question from Jennifer Huffman. What do you recommend for effective strategies to talk with my local council members about the possibility of an AI data center being installed in my small town? Specifically encouraging council to tighten up various ordinances like sound and light, or to discourage a data center from being built here.
Apologies, searching for the unmute button. Unless Sean, you were quicker.
Yeah, okay. I would suggest two things. The first thing is that under all circumstances, I would encourage any local advocates who are facing this scenario to discourage the county or municipalities in which you live from offering any tax incentives whatsoever, and to maximize whatever leverage you have, including perhaps pursuing either pilot programs or requirements that data centers locally source things. Now, that only helps mitigate what they might do if they're built. The second thing I would really encourage you to do is raise as much hell as possible. And that's because if the data center that you're facing is a co-location center, meaning that it's not Amazon or Meta, but rather it's a developer who's trying to develop a data center where they're going to rent space effectively to a bunch of different tenants, those kinds of data centers generally are being funded by debt. They have to go out to money markets and find money and financing to build them. And they also have to go out and find tenants to occupy them. And both funders and tenants get nervous as hell when they see lots of community opposition. It increases the cost of money, it increases risk, and it increases the likelihood that the data center will never be built.
Yeah, and I echo all of that, 110%. The only other piece that I'll add, and I've seen some bits of it popping up in the chat, people are beating me to it, is talk to your officials and talk to them about ordinances. What we have found in our work here at Penn Future is that when a new use, it used to be warehouses and now we're at data centers, when a new use comes into town, a lot of municipal officials, a lot of municipalities don't have an ordinance on the book, which means that they lose a lot of control over what can happen. So have a frank and honest conversation with your municipal officials if you're able to, and say, hey, there are data center model ordinances out there. Penn Future has one. I saw some folks were dropping some others there in the chat. So organizations are creating them, And again, what is being shared around, they tend to be models. So no matter what organizations you're looking at, no matter which ordinance, they can be adjusted because every community is unique. They have unique needs, unique concerns. And so helping municipal officials getting out in front before it actually ends up in the town or borough is incredibly important.
Thank you for that. And I think it was also dropped in the chat that Penn Future has resources on data centers on our website, and we will share that following up, including the ordinance. Um, this is a question from Chad, and I don't know if this was more of a question or just remarking how it's a crazy sentence. Fields is a scenario in which economic strategy takes precedence over energy strategy. Donna, this is probably you, our Team PA expert. What does that mean, is the question.
Yeah, what's really funny is when I saw that come through, I laughed out loud because asked that exact same question every time I read this. And I mean, my understanding, my interpretation, and I think they kind of say this in that scenario, is that for that scenario, they were focusing on um, economic development instead of reducing emissions. I don't understand why they put that in there because none of them focus on reducing emissions. So that is my best interpretation for you. That is my reading of the literal text, if I could get academic on that question. Read what you will into that. That's the best I can do.
Awesome. Another one from Tracy. How do we develop a strategy that helps shape conversation around distinctions between AI that can be beneficial versus that which is harmful? Philosophical question, really, a big, broader overview.
Okay, I'll bite. I'll go into this. I should say that, within the ORV team, there's actually a lot of disagreement about data centers and whether they're intrinsically evil at one extreme or whether, they actually can perform a lot of very helpful functions and whether they're necessary. And I think that, there are arguments across the spectrum at all points in between. But I think there is one thing that we can agree on, and I think this is really important for how we engage with local officials. And that is whether we're going to have data centers or not, whether we're going to oppose them or not, we as advocates have to be able to function on two tracks simultaneously. On the one hand, we probably want to oppose them in most cases. But on the other hand, we also have to recognize that they may just be an inevitability in some cases, in which case we also need to be able to make sure that if they arise, that we get a good deal from them, or at least the best deal possible. Because the one thing that should be able to unite all policymakers, whether they're pro data center or anti data center, is that no one should be for a bad deal. And right now, in most of Pennsylvania, that's what we're getting. Data centers that don't generate tax income because the taxes have been waived, that don't provide jobs, and don't do much else. That's of no benefit to anyone in Pennsylvania. And that's a point that I think we can make to all legislators, regardless of whether they're pro, anti, or somewhere in between.
Thank you, Sean. And thank you, Tracy, for that question.
Yeah, I'll just add, and um, my staff has heard me say this. We're currently building the dumbest version of all of this, in terms of how we're getting the energy, how much cooling it requires. There are, and I think some people said this in the chat or in the Q&A. There are potential things on the medical side and advances that may ultimately be useful from some of these technologies, but the rush to embed it into everything we're doing in order, frankly, to justify the build out of a lot of other things in order to jack the price of natural gas, um, that's not the way to approach this.
All right, we'll ask a few more questions. I know we're at 7. If folks have to hop off, we'll have the recording. we'll just go on for just a few more minutes. Those really good questions. This is with an aging population in a rural area, would young people, professionals, want to live in an area near these data centers? Great question.
I'm I'm going to jump into this one just to share some insights into how Team PA played this out in one of their scenarios. I forget which one it was, but I think it might have been homesteads. In their vision, it's interesting that you mentioned the aging population. So we do have an interesting situation in Pennsylvania where our overall population is getting much older and we're losing younger population. And so in that one scenario, they played it out saying that as the population ages, they need those folks that are aging need their children, their family members to come back to the state. And that will be what generates population growth among younger folks in order to care for their elders. And that, oddly enough, was like the thing that they thought was going to bring in the population. And so at that point, they didn't say specifically these folks would love to live next to data centers, but they did count on this influx of young folks to care for the elderly to kind of revitalize rural areas and even some former energy communities. So especially when it comes to former energy communities, if you have those former assets, I imagine gas plants would end up there if you play the scenario out. And then you would indeed, yes, by their logic, have younger
And
folks moving to them.
I just want to point out that the same argument was made for the natural gas boom, that it would create jobs in rural areas and attract population growth and younger people. And in fact, exactly the opposite happened. Population is my favorite statistic because, frankly, it's the one in which the natural gas counties in Pennsylvania have suffered the most. When you have an industry that, again, I hate to keep repeating that same phrase, is highly capital intensive and not labor intensive, there really isn't any incentive for younger people to move back. I know that many policymakers have visions when you use the term data center, visions of kind of leafy campuses of highly educated professionals milling around, having coffees in the quad and doing all those sorts of things are the images that dance in their heads, when in fact what they're getting are industrial warehouses. The subjective notion of what data centers are is almost diametrically opposed to the objective reality of what they are. And that, among other things, is what needs to be emphasized to local policymakers and to not be deluded about what kind of facility they're getting.
Yeah, the two very quick things I would add are one, we're talking about technologies that at their core are designed to encourage greater mobility in population. So the idea that that would mean people are back in rural areas in choosing that is I'm not going to say it won't happen and people won't choose that in some cases, but I don't think it's going to be because of or in spite of that. I think it will just be, personal preference. The other, and it's very worth seeking out. We didn't show them here, but I've seen on some other webinars from some other organizations video of these uh, essentially right up against like baseball fields and things like that. And they're not noisy in an industrial way, but the decibels are such that they operate constantly at the volume of kind of this conversation. Like just imagine hearing our voices, hearing voices in a room and just having that going for 24/7 in your backyard, in your area. That is one of the other impacts I don't think people talk about or appreciate as much is there's a noise component of this that probably falls below a lot of noise ordinances, but is constant. It's just a constant hum that communities are now living with, particularly in Virginia in Data Center Alley there.
All of which is to say, it drives me nuts. Don't be fooled when you hear them use the word campus to describe a data center. It's not a campus, at least not in any way that we would recognize.
All right, thank you for that. Um, I will ask just a few more questions, and yeah, this was an interesting question from Maggie. I found that people don't really buy what I'm saying because I'm not seen as a professional with in-depth knowledge. What is your suggestion for people who want to approach their families with data center warnings? How can we be good messengers and be taken seriously? I think tonight we saw a lot of good reports that could be used as good tools to kind of help showcase that conversation, but I'll let folks kind of build off of that.
Well, I'm somewhat embarrassed by the question because if Orvie has a mission in this world, it's to help address challenges like this one, right? I would suggest, especially on this particular topic, if you're inclined, go to the Ohio River Valley Institute website, ohiorivervalleyinstitute.org. There is a specific article on the website, which I think right now is on the homepage, but which you can find called Why Data Centers Will Be Economic Development Duds. And it, I think, in a pretty accessible way, goes far deeper into many of the points that we've made right now, and does it, I hope, in a reasonably common sense way that allows you to make some of the key points, both about mostly about the economics. It doesn't really address the environmental and quality of life impacts of data centers, but I hope you can find some resources there.
And I'll add, just because resources are fantastic, on the environmental side, Penn Future, we have a series of very short videos. They were designed to be digestible. So if you're looking for more information, potentially some terms, and make it easier to talk about some of these things, we'll share the link. I know we did earlier, but we can do it again. I think we have about 8 videos. They'll address anything from water to electricity use. We do a very brief job of talking about the economics, but I highly recommend looking at Sean's blog. It's really helpful. And check those out. And we think they're digestible. They will show you how a data center works, show you the insides of them if you have questions about like the cooling centers and things like that, if you want to get that deep into it. And just as a reference point, we have had municipal officials watch those and reach out to our staff here at Penn Future. So if you feel like you want to take your talking points to a bit of a higher level, you can go there. Yeah, but otherwise, I guess it depends upon your audience, who you're talking
I
to.
was going to say, and with respect to the audience, we live in a world where right now affordability is the buzzword in politics in Washington and elsewhere, and I think in the minds of many, many, many people. And this is an issue that cuts just fiercely against data center development because, especially in Pennsylvania, more than in my home state of West Virginia, especially in Pennsylvania, you guys are getting hammered with rising electric bills. And that's an issue that anyone can relate to. And so, if you need a lid lifter, a wedge issue to initiate the conversation and say, this is something we should all care about, it's issues like that that cut across issues of ideology and everything else. People hate it when their electric bills go up, and that's what's happening.
And to follow up on that, a statistic, I think it's from 2024, about 24% of Pennsylvanians were behind on their electricity bill because they couldn't afford them. So that's huge. There's a huge amount of Pennsylvanians. And so it's not just, affordability is kind of the buzzword right now, but for a lot of folks, um, it's not just about affordability. It's about, can I turn the lights on, right? So I think there's so many ways you can come at this. I hope some of those help.
Do one more question. And I think this is the most questions we ever got during a webinar, which is fantastic. And a little overwhelming, but we can definitely follow up. I want to reiterate that I'm determined to get answers to a lot of these really good questions. This was a question that somebody asked when they registered during the webinar. I'm trying to get some of those as well. What tax incentives are being offered to Team PA, and what added costs do the local people have to share due to data center activity? And I think we've mentioned a lot of those added costs, but
The
um,
I'm sorry, the first piece that jumps out at me is just to be clear, Team PA is not receiving the tax incentives. It is the developers and the companies who are building the data centers and putting the hardware in there. We've got a computer equipment tax incentive at the state level. And so just to be clear, I just wanted to say that Team PA does not receive the tax incentives, but the companies do. And Sean, I'm sure you've got a lot to say on this.
I'm obligated now. Um, no, what I would point out is that Donna just alluded to what is real, the state sales and use tax, which has been waived in Pennsylvania. And so data centers basically pay not no state taxes, but very, very little relative to what they would have to pay if they had to operate by the rules of pretty much any other company in the economy. But I also want to emphasize again, and this is great for local activism, that local governments can waive property taxes by up to 75% in Pennsylvania. And that is an arbitrary choice. They have it wholly within their power to go to that degree of abatement or not. And property taxes are the primary source of revenue that data centers generate. So I would target those. Now, I would also, though, point out here's the problem. In fact, this is the only problem. If it were simply the case that our electric rates are going up by, 20, 30, 40% more than data centers are injecting into the economy, then we'd probably vote them the hell out anyway. The problem is that the tax revenue from data centers is concentrated in individual communities, whereas the cost for electric bills is spread across the entire state. And so, even though data centers are collectively a net economic loser for Pennsylvania, if you're one of the local governments that has a data center within your jurisdiction, you might individually see an advantage, which is why a county commission or a municipal government might actually be supportive, even though any benefit that they happen to derive from data centers is coming at the expense of all other Pennsylvanians. And that's an asymmetry that makes it very, very difficult to move local policymakers on this issue because individually their communities may see some financial benefit, even though it's coming at the expense of everyone else.
thank you for that. Do we have any final thoughts or comments from our panel tonight? A lot has been
Uh,
covered.
Just
I
gratitude to Sean. I
I
couldn't
was
have
gonna
said that
say,
last part better myself.
I always love participating in a webinar where I learn a lot. So, thanks, Donna, thanks, Sean, for participating.
And thank you guys. Really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, and thank you everybody for sticking over an hour. I know we didn't have time to answer all the questions. We will follow up with the recording, the slideshow, answering some questions. Thank you all for working with us as we come together to create a more equitable and sustainable Commonwealth for all. And everyone have a good night.